and welcome to The Bookshelf, a segment where we discuss the latest books pertinent to South Asia. Our guest today is Mohamed Zeeshan, author of Flying Blind, India's Quest for Global Leadership. The book traces India's foreign policy since independence to the present times when it is at a crossroads trying to build its geopolitical influence. This subject comes easily to Zeeshan, who is a foreign affairs columnist, consultant, and the editor-in-chief of Freedom Gazette. He has previously worked with the Indian delegation to the United Nations in New York and with global consulting firm Carney. As a consultant, he has advised governments across the Middle East on economic and political modernization and helped draft a multilateral declaration on cybersecurity at last year's G20 summit in Riyadh. Thank you for joining us today, Zeeshan.
Thank you, Nithya, for having me. I'm very delighted to be here.
So let me start by the inevitable question. What prompted you to write this book and why the title Flying Blind? Also, what interested me and maybe the audience in Singapore is that you have referred to Lee Kuan Yew right up early in the book. So could you tell us more about that?
Sure. This book has been a few years in the making. I actually first conceived of it sometime in early 2017 when I was at Columbia. I've been a peripatetic traveler throughout my life. I was born outside India and, studied in various different countries and then later on worked. My father was also based in several different countries around the world. And one of the things that really struck me was the fact that Indians abroad are treated rather differently from, not in every country, but in many countries, are treated differently from Westerners and countries that one would think of as quote unquote influential. And so I started looking into this more deeply while I was at Columbia and then at the UN and then in the Middle East where I worked. As I quote in my book, there was a Pew survey that was conducted in 2018, which found that India's influence, the question that survey asked was whether India is as important, more important, or less important in world affairs as compared to 10 years ago, which at that point in time was 2008. And I was shocked to find that in only one country did more than 50% of the people say that India was now more important. And that country was India. And in most other countries around the world, especially in developing countries, people were actually rather skeptical. I think about a third of the people in that survey said that India had actually become less important in 2018 as compared to 2008. So at the same time here in India, you've got, of course, the political rhetoric around India being a global leader or a Vishwa Guru, as they say in Hindi. And so there's a huge mismatch, I think, between India's perception of its own influence and its practice of its influence abroad and the way that the rest of the world perceives India. And I found this extremely unfortunate because India is a very large and consequential country. It's a nuclear power state. It's one of the largest economies in the world. It's one of the youngest economies in the world. And so therefore, India will be a very important integral part of the future workforce of the world. And yet, despite all of these facts, India is not able to assert itself. It's not able to enjoy influence. And as a result, it's not able to command greater bargaining chips on international trade and several other aspects of global governance. The Indian passport tends to be one of the weaker passports in the world. Indians, therefore, are not able to enjoy business opportunities and employment opportunities as easily as other countries around the world. And so I put all of these things together to try and understand why foreign policy influence matters to the common man in India. The farmers, the factory workers, and of course the students and working professionals abroad, the diaspora, very large diaspora abroad. And that's what brought me down to writing this book. I called it Flying Blind because it's not to cock a snook at the Indian establishment. Of course, India is flying blind in my opinion, but India is still flying because a country as large and influential as or rather consequential as India cannot crawl, it can only fly. The problem is that India tends not to exert and enjoy as much influence abroad because we tend not to act towards a certain coherent direction and a certain coherent set of objectives. And so as a result, we're not able to build constituencies of support abroad because we do not, quite often represent and fulfill their interests in a consistent and reliable manner. So that was what brought me to the rather controversial, if you will, or provocative rather, title, Flying Blind. You're talking about Lee Kuan Yew. Lee Kuan Yew has been a subject of, he's been an enigmatic subject here in India. A lot of mayors and chief ministers in various Indian cities and states have come and gone, including here in Bangalore, where I am, saying that we will transform our cities into Singapore. I would not say Bangalore is Singapore yet. The first time that I heard this was from a former chief minister of Karnataka, S.M. Krishna, who was chief minister in the early 2000s, who said that he will transform Bangalore into Singapore. But the thing with Singapore, which many people do not realize here in India, is that Lee Kuan Yew and Jawaharlal Nehru and other founding fathers of the Indian Republic did not share the same vision of development. Lee Kuan Yew believed that development was much more important than democracy. Democracy and freedom can be built over a period of time. He believed, I write in my book, that democracy can oftentimes be a drag on development and public services delivery. And so when Indira Gandhi proclaimed the emergency, he was one of those voices abroad that was actually supportive of Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. Whereas in the Indian Republic, India's founding fathers believed that democracy should be an end by and of itself. It's not meant, it was not proclaimed in order to give development to the Indian people. Of course, that was one of the aims. But the Indian founding fathers believed that we can do with some inefficiencies and ineffectiveness in government. What we cannot do is curbing the freedoms of the Indian people, because we were coming out of colonial rule under the British, who had done that. And so the key impetus for the Indian Republic was that we must fulfill freedom and democracy, and then over a period of time we start working towards development. Of course, the Nehruvian state believed that state control of the economy would give the Indian people development, but that, of course, did not happen to the scale to which Nehru hoped it would fulfill. But after 1991, we undertook various economic reforms, and as I argue in my book, that actually happened only because of India's democracy.
You also, in your book, you make two very interesting points on India's foreign policy. One, you've said that India has always held its neighborhood first policy, and it is now time to turn that from a distraction to an asset. And you also talk about India's resistance or reticence to taking policy stance in international issues. And it comes from this fence sitter attitude that you talk about. So do you think that under Narendra Modi, this has changed?
Look, I don't think that India's foreign policy has changed very dramatically in recent decades, really. I think that the last person to bring, in my view, a lasting or sustainable change in Indian foreign policy was perhaps Prime Minister Indira Gandhi. Jawaharlal Nehru took a very internationalist outlook to foreign policy. So this neighborhood first policy, I would say, was more Indira Gandhi's brainchild than Nehru's brainchild. Nehru played a role in the Congo. He played a role in Korea, in Indochina, and so on and so forth. But Indira Gandhi believed that as a result of the threat from Pakistan, as well as the war with China in 1962, India needed to constrain its expenditure, if you will, of resources abroad, outside the neighborhood. And so Indira Gandhi's template became that India's primary objective should be to fight against threats that are coming from the immediate neighborhood, namely Pakistan and China, more so Pakistan during her tenure than China. And over a period of time, if you see, India has gotten itself caught in tangles in the neighborhood, we have expended enormous amount of strategic thinking and resources on fighting cross-border terrorism from Pakistan, counterfeit money from Nepal, illegal immigrants from Bangladesh, refugees from Sri Lanka, and so on and so forth. And now with climate change coming up, I think we might even have to fight against an influx of refugees from the Maldives. I would say we should resettle them and rehabilitate them, but the general tendency in Indian strategic thinking is to see anything coming in from outside, whether refugees or terrorists, as a threat to India's national security. So that has been the general demeanor of Indian foreign policy, neighborhood first. Now, what Prime Minister Narendra Modi has done is he has not really changed this outlook or even the fence sitting posture very much. But in some sense, it has become more deeply entrenched and in some sense even dangerous, because fighting threats from the neighborhood has now been conflated with identity politics in India. And so the Hindu Rashtra now sees Hindu refugees from Afghanistan and Pakistan and Bangladesh as part of India, but Muslims and Christians from these countries are considered outsiders and foreigners. And that has also led to a proposed citizenship test here in India itself. And so therefore, many people in India who are Indian citizens who do not have documents, if the NRC, which is the National Register of Citizens, goes through, will find themselves also being considered doubtful Indian citizens and possibly outsiders and foreigners. So we've seen this neighborhood first policy becoming conflated with identity politics. And so Narendra Modi government is not only more deeply entrenched than Indira Gandhi government in the Indian neighborhood, it's actually gotten much more catastrophic and chaotic and disastrous and dangerous, controversial problems as well. Now, on fence sitting, I think that, by and large, Prime Minister Modi actually, when he came to power, he meant to change this fence sitting posture. I quote one of his early addresses to Indian diplomats where, Prime Minister said that India needs to play a leading role and not a balancing role. And I took that to mean that he wants India to move away from fence sitting. We need to start taking stances and opinions on various international crises. But that has not really happened by and large. I think that India has in some sense forayed out into the Indian Ocean, so to speak, but we have not really built or cultivated any alliances and coalitions there. India has tended to drag its feet even on the Quad until the Ladakh clashes. And outside of China and the immediate extended neighborhood, India has not hold any strong stances or positions on anything. For instance, you will never hear India speak about the political crisis in Haiti today or the protests in Brazil and Cuba today. India will never talk about the several civil wars that raged across Africa and continue to rage to this day. India has not taken a stance on Syria or Iraq. India has not taken a stance on Israel and Palestine one way or the other. India has tended to traditionally support the Palestinian voice, but in recent times, we've seen that this has also started getting diluted. And so India has started to play, both sides of the fence, even on Israel and Palestine in the last year and a half. So I don't think that Modi has really followed through on his vision of pulling India out of its fence-sitting posture.
You've mentioned the Quad, and I think we'll come to the Quad a little later. But you've also spoken or commented on how foreign policy is practiced in India. On one hand, we do know that there is a dearth of diplomats each year. Only a small group of elite join the diplomatic service. But on the other hand, we see politicians who consider this to be a luxury, foreign policy to be a luxury. And very often they make comments or statements due to their own internal political compulsions. So do you see a dichotomy there? And how do you think this can be rectified?
Look, I think India being a democracy, domestic politics is always going to play a role in India's foreign policy. But I think what is making this progressively worse over a period of time, in my opinion, is that, as I said, the Narendra Modi government has conflated domestic identity politics with neighborhood policy. And so in the past, we've seen that Tamil Nadu politicians have oftentimes confused India's policy in Sri Lanka. West Bengal politicians have oftentimes stymied India's outreach to Bangladesh on water sharing, land boundary dispute, and so on. But now it has gotten much more dangerous because this is now a pan India narrative of the Hindu Rashtra that we are now seeing. And India's immediate neighbors are not Hindu Rashtras. Many of them are either Muslim majority countries, one is a Buddhist majority country. And so, therefore, as a result, it sets India on a collision course with each of its neighbors, makes that situation much more potent. Now, the problem with having this pan-India domestic identity politics playing into neighborhood policy is that it does not allow strategic thinkers in New Delhi to think in a rational manner. They're not now thinking about India's national interests. They're thinking about domestic political interests and how that interacts with Bangladesh and Pakistan and the Maldives. So it might be in India's national interest to, for instance, integrate the South Asian neighborhood. But we cannot do that because we now, in our domestic politics, see these countries as threats and enemies because they are not Hindu Rashtras. So, in that sense, I think that it has gotten much worse. The only way that this can be rectified, I think, is through statesmanship at the very, very top. I think that there was a very genuine opportunity for Prime Minister Narendra Modi because he was commanding, the first single party majority in India in several years. And so he had very genuine political capital if he wanted to use that capital to build a much more, not just inclusive Indian identity, but also an inclusive South Asian identity, which builds a South Asian umbrella under which Buddhist Sinhalese can live, Bangladeshi Muslims can live, Pakistani Muslims can live, Indian Muslims can live, Hindu Indians can live, Hindu tribes in Nepal can live, and so on and so forth. But we were not able to, and he did not rather choose to build this sort of a cohesive or inclusive, South Asian umbrella identity. And so, as a result, we've gone further and further down this path of adulteration, I will say, of domestic politics in foreign policy.
We'll move a little eastwards to China, and you've written at great length on China's foreign policy. And, you've rightly observed that India and China are by no means equal. But why do you think, in that case, why do you think China likes to needle India? I mean, we very often see these confrontations and very often there is no end result to it. So why this needling?
Well, there are two factors. I think on the one hand, China in recent years has gotten much more aggressive towards its neighbors. And it's not just India. I think, even before the recent clashes took place in Ladakh, of course, Indian-China border has gone through several such skirmishes, only that this one was much more dramatic. But the infrastructure build-up that we're now seeing from the Chinese army has already taken place in the South China Sea, for instance, where islands have been militarized in recent years. So China has gotten more aggressive with all of its neighbors. And India, being a neighbor, has also come under fire. And in my book, I say that one of the reasons for this could be that Xi Jinping wants to build a sort of more muscular Chinese nationalism at home in order to build legitimacy for his own rule. Xi Jinping has become much more authoritarian within China than even past Chinese presidents. The last time that we saw this sort of a personality cult in China was under Mao Zedong. So Mao Zedong is thrown back to much more problematic in Chinese history with the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution and the famines that took place, the violence that took place, and so on. So I think Xi Jinping wants to build some kind of legitimacy for himself to say, okay, I am different from previous Chinese presidents, even though the economy is not doing as well as it did in past decades today. I am different from past Chinese presidents because I'm taking China to a position of power and influence. And China, being the middle kingdom, has to assert itself, therefore, in the immediate Asian neighborhood. And that's what Xi Jinping is now trying to do. But the second factor that I think is more unique to India is that India is the largest country in China's neighborhood. But India is also a democracy and a functional democracy in China's neighborhood. So Chinese dissidents, democratic dissidents, could quite oftentimes, point fingers at India and the U.S. and say that if the U.S. can create economic growth, if India can create economic growth, why do we have to have this iron hand, iron fisted leadership in China to create economic growth? Now, the US is very easily explained away, as I argue in my book, because, the US had a head start. It's a 250-year-old democracy. It was already wealthier to begin with. It's also only a country of 350 million people, so it's much smaller and so on. But India is not so easily explained away. If India can create sustainable economic growth and become a world power and exert influence around the world, then people are obviously going to say, India also was as poor as we were in 1991 and 92. And India had 200 years of colonial rule behind it. India is a very large and diverse country with over 1 billion people. So if India can create power and influence and economic growth with democracy, then why can't China? So therefore, I think in some sense, Indian democracy is a long-term existential threat to the Chinese Communist Party. It is not immediately a threat because India is, much poorer than China. And if there was a race today between India and China, then India is certainly much further behind. But India has got very youthful demographics. The US wants to invest in India's national power. And if India does some very simple things correctly, then India can certainly build its power and influence in the decades to come. And that would become a threat to the Chinese Communist Party. And so therefore, China wants to, I think, in my view, contain India's rise outside of South Asia.
You just mentioned America in your answer, and before that you spoke about the Quad, and that brings me to my second last question, which talks about the last two chapters of your book, which have very interesting titles: The Old Guard, The World America Built, and The New Guard, The World India Should Build. We have seen in the recent times Quad has been gaining prominence, and there is a coming together of this so-called Old Guard and New Guard. How do you think the two countries, which are also the most prominent democracies, something that you alluded to just now, work together? And how can India leverage the current geopolitical environment to further its cause, its interests?
Look, I think that as a result of common political and even economic systems, I would say, in India and the US believes that it is in its interest to invest in India's national power and capacity. And it has been doing that for the last several years with the nuclear deal and trying to get India into various forums and platforms around the world. Um, from the US's point of view, I think this is a long-term investment that Washington wants to make because it believes that India will want to pursue very, very similar ideals and values in global governance, on human rights, on the environment, on trade and globalization, and all of these other things, because very similar interests are required for India in order for India's economy to grow in the decades to come. Now, the problem here for India is that Indian politics has taken India in a somewhat different direction in the last couple of years in particular. Uh, India has itself been guilty of what people in the US would call human rights violations, internet shutdowns, putting people behind bars for sedition charges and other such things. On the world stage as well, India has become much more protectionist actually on trade and globalization. India was never as open to free trade as the US wanted India to be, and as India itself should have wanted to be for its own economic interests. But in recent years, actually, India has gone in the opposite direction. I quote some stats in my book as well from the Global Trade Alert database, which found that India, I think, at that point in time when I wrote the book in late 2020, was the second most protectionist country in the G20 after America. And America was only protectionist there because of Donald Trump and the various tariffs and trade barriers that he had erected, which Joe Biden has vowed to bring down over a period of time. So India has actually gone in the opposite direction. And then after the pandemic, we started hearing murmurs of Atmanirbhar Bharat, or self-reliant India, which some people started saying is a throwback to basically the import substitution policies of the past. So India is going on reverse gear here in some sense. And I think the US will have to take cognizance of this, and India will also have to take cognizance of this and decide in New Delhi once and for all, okay, what is our long-term interest? Do we an open economy or a closed economy? Are we going to be a democracy, or are we going to violate human rights? Are we going to speak up for people around the world for their self-determination and democratic rights? All of these sorts of things need to be decided in New Delhi on a long-term basis, not just for this government, but also for the governments to come. And so in that sense, I think India has gotten more confused. And what is really holding the Quad now together is just really the threat from China. So if India is able to sit across the table with China and say that, look, we will accept your suzerainty in Asia Pacific if you accept that South Asia is our personal primary playground, I think that there is still a possibility that India and China will be able to reach that kind of an understanding, provided that they are going to be following very similar values and interests in global governance, which is where I think, unfortunately, India is today heading. So it's a matter of flux. I think one will have to see which direction Indian politics really goes in years to come.
Towards the end of the book, in the epilogue, you point out that regardless of their individual cultural backgrounds, Indians are inherently global in nature. But the vision of a globalized world community may not appear immediate to an average Indian citizen who has not traveled out of the region. Could you please elaborate on this?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at India's civilizational history over the last, 3,000 or 5,000 years, India has always been the land where what is foreign comes home to become Indian. And so, we've assimilated from west and east and north and south all the way back, until ancient Indian civilization. So the Indus Valley civilization was itself a multiracial hodgepodge. And obviously, that diversity and mixture got much more heterogeneous over a period of time. And unlike China, for instance, no major Indian empire really managed to shut the doors and homogenize the Indian population. And it's not that we haven't had emperors in the past that tried to do this. Ashoka, for instance, tried to propagate Buddhism in India. And then, of course, you had various Muslim emperors like Aurangzeb and Alauddin Khilji, who tried to propagate Islam. You had the British colonial missionaries who tried to propagate Christianity. And yet, none of these people, despite the might of their empire, were really able to, and the propaganda of the state apparatus, none of them were really able to homogenize the Indian civilization, which is rather unique in that sense in world history. And so India, I think, in some sense, as a civilization, the instinctive thrust of Indian civilization is to be heterogeneous, to be more diverse. And I think that is one of India's great strengths. And that is what I say in my book, that in terms of holding a multicultural democracy and being successful as a multicultural democracy, India has this as its inherent instinctive strength, that it's always an open civilization. It tends to bring in from outside, it tends to assimilate, it's very open-minded to new ideas, whether that's Western or Southern or Northern or Eastern. And as a result, I think that has strengthened Indian democracy as well. And in the absence of that kind of openness, Indian democracy cannot really survive. Now, I do agree that, unfortunately, in recent times, I think what I'm seeing is that there is a sense that this openness is starting to, get diluted a little bit. There is an ethno-nationalist impulse in Indian politics today. There is a protectionist impulse, whether that's economic protectionism or political protectionism. And Atmanirbhar Bharat in many ways sounds like, or a self-reliant India as it's translated, in many ways sounds like an India that is saying that, oh, we've been open to the rest of the world for so many years. And now because of coronavirus, we've been hit and we've been hurt. Many Hindu nationalists tend to think that foreign ideas are a threat to Hinduism. And so therefore, let us close off the doors and become quote unquote self-reliant. But this is extremely unusual in India's civilizational history. And the case that I make in my book as well is that, if emperors over the past history were not able to do this successfully, there is no way that the Republic of India and a multicultural democratic culture as India does have is going to successfully become homogenous. And one hopes that that is not going to be the case, that we continue to be heterogeneous, because that really is inherently India's great strength.
Thank you so much, Zeeshan, for joining us today. It was lovely to have you at the bookshelf.
Thank you for having me, Nithya.